All right, good morning, everyone. Hope you all had a nice weekend. And now we're back for more. So last week we did a lot of back end, and this week we're transitioning more to the front end, and then we'll continue to reference back and build out the rest of our back end. And so today we're learning front end. And so who has heard of this term MVC before? A few of you? Does anybody actually know what it means? A few? So it stands for Model View Controller, and it's a design and organizational pattern for creating applications. And so it's a way to keep organized and, just mainly stay organized. And what it does is it separates your data, your visuals, and your logic into separate components. And then, so models manage your data and information, and so that's things like your database or your config file or any other just hard-coded information. And so that's where you turn to update information. And views manage the visual representation and turns them into templates. And so if you're talking about web pages, that's pretty much the HTML and CSS. And then controllers manage the user interface and translates that into logic, which then updates the models, which then updates the view. So can anybody picture how that works? Morning. So we have models, views, controllers, and the user. And so the user, what are they interacting with? Yeah, so they see the views, so sees. And then if they play around with the views, what is that then doing? It's interfacing with the controllers, because the controllers manages the UI, the user interface, and then turns that into logic. So they update the controllers, or they use the controllers. The controllers then update the models. So if they change any of the information, it then has to store it in the model, so updates, which in turn updates the views. Does that make sense to everybody? And so the whole point of this is organization and to stay organized on the server more. And so as you see, when we talk about frameworks, a lot of them have this built in. Does anybody have any questions on MVC? We'll get to play with it a little bit more during the exercises today. And so we'll be talking about some tools that front-end engineers use, namely templating engines, CSS preprocessors, JavaScript libraries and frameworks, and task runners. So is everybody familiar with CSS and HTML, or do you want a quick refresher on that? All right, so I'm going to assume that most people are familiar with CSS and HTML. If not, just stop me and I'm happy to talk about it. And so first, templating engines. So namely Pug, it used to be called Jade, Mustache, EJS, Handlebars, Haml, etc. Who took CS50 this year? Does anybody remember what templating engine you used? Jinja, exactly. So Jinja was Python's templating engine. And so these are ones for Node.js or JavaScript in general. And so what it does is it simplifies the process of writing HTML. It keeps your files consistent and organized. And it speeds up your development since you're not writing a bunch of tags unnecessarily. And then so the one we're going to choose is Pug. And so I'll give you a quick example of what Pug code looks like. So here we have a side-to-side where the left, can you guys all read that? So left we have Pug, and on the right we have the same exact HTML. And so what are some things we noticed about the Pug? Yeah, so we don't have to write angle brackets. Pug knows, or the creators of Pug saw, hey, every single tag has unnecessary angle brackets. It's just wasting time typing, so why use them? What are some other things we notice?
You don't need to close the
Yeah, we don't have to close the tags, and so the way we take care of that is everything within the same line is within that tag, and everything indented below that tag is also within the same tag. Yeah.
There's logic.
Yeah, we have some basic logic. So we have for var I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. What language does that look like? JavaScript, yeah, it's JavaScript. And then we can go ahead and iterate through list items. And we can also use that variable within the list item. And so we have list item, number, and then the way you get a JavaScript variable is the hashtag, and then curlies, and then any JavaScript within that. And so over here, it looks like it generates list items 0 through 9. Great. And so we also have CSS preprocessors, which are pretty much the same thing, but for CSS. Some names are stylus, sass, SCSS, less. Has anybody used any of these before? A little bit? And so it's the same exact thing. It simplifies the process of writing CSS. And it gives you basic logic, because CSS has absolutely no logic. So we get variables, which is nice. Why might we want to use variables in CSS? Yeah?
So you could reuse the same style for different things over and over.
Exactly. We can reuse the same style for a bunch of things, and then if we want to then change it later, we change it in one place rather than having to find it, every single instance of it in the CSS. We get if-else statements, loops, math, imports. And so the one we're going to choose is called stylus, and so I'll give you a quick rundown on how that works. And so again, we have the stylus on the left and CSS on the right. Any quick things you notice about the stylus? They look fairly similar, right? So the nice thing about stylus is CSS is stylus. So stylus is a superset of CSS, which means if you have a CSS file and you just change the .css to .styl, it is now a stylus file. And so if you're used to writing CSS, you can go ahead and do that directly into a stylus file, and it's perfectly fine. The syntax works out. All curly braces are now optional. And you have variables at the top. So I have text color gets #000, which is black. I have a button color transparent, and a button color transparent alternate. I define a mobile width, a default border. If I scroll down, you can see me start to use those down here. Any questions on stylus? How it could be handy? Nope. We also have JavaScript libraries. Has anybody used a JavaScript library before? See some net heads. What one might you have used? CS50 uses it quite often, as does a lot of the world. jQuery, yeah. So jQuery is definitely the most popular one. There are others like underscore D3. If you take CS171, they teach D3. Moment, there's a lot others. And it gives you a set of tools that you can call at will. So does anybody know the difference between a library and a framework? So you may have heard these terms thrown around. There's a slight distinction. So libraries they give you tools that you can then use. Whereas frameworks is a whole bare bones application that you can now extend to. So the difference is you call the library code, whereas the framework calls your code. And so that's called an inversion of control. So JavaScript libraries, they give you sets of tools that you can call at will. So you are using their tools. You are using their methods. The nice thing about them is they're generally cross-browser supported. They can make code easier to read. And they can speed up development if you're handy with that library. Frameworks, some examples are Angular 1, Angular 2, React, Ember, Meteor, Backbone. Lots of very popular JavaScript frameworks. And what it does, it gives you a skeleton application that you can then extend with your own code. And so the difference between a framework and library, again, is that the frameworks, they have like a flow of the application already, and will call your code as it goes through. So libraries, you call their code. Frameworks, it calls your code. Some nice things that you get are virtual DOM manipulation. Does everybody know what the DOM is? Does anybody not know? Okay, so DOM stands for Document Object Model. And it's a way to visualize an HTML page. So every HTML page is called a document, and you can visualize it as sort of a tree-like structure. So at the top we have the document, which may have a head and a body. And so in this one here, you can see we have doc type HTML, which is the document. We have a head, which has a title. And within the title, we have some text called example page. And so that's the tree for the head. In the body, we have an H1, we have a P. And we have a bunch of list items thrown there. There should be an unordered list. And then under the H1, we have some text. Under the P, we have some text. Under what's missing but what should be an unordered list, we have a bunch of list items. And in each list item, we have some text. And so we can represent every single HTML page as a tree. And that tree we call the document object model. And so what's nice about JavaScript frameworks is it keeps track of a virtual DOM. And so it lets you update parts of it at a time without refreshing the entire thing. We also get data bindings where you can bind a variable to a tag and have the tag automatically update depending on when the variable updates. And it's very componentized, which means a lot of them follow the MVC model and allow you to keep your code not only separated into its logic and its data and the controllers or its views, but it also will only call them when they're needed. And so I read through the Angular docs, and this was a line: write less code, go have beer sooner. And so why wouldn't we want to use libraries and frameworks? It sounds like they're great, right? You write less code, it's easier. What are some possible downsides? Can anybody think of any? Yeah?
You can't customize certain parts of it? Like it's
Yeah.
there for you?
It might be difficult to then customize things. You'd have to go understand all of their code before you start adding or subtracting from it. Yeah? What do you mean by more time? Yeah, it's a huge library, so you have loading time. You also have time to learn the library. So yeah, time is definitely an issue. Can anybody think of any other things? So yeah, load time, bandwidth. Every single time a user loads that page, they'll have to also load that entire library. And it's generally not super modular, at least libraries aren't. If you want a single method, you still have to include that entire library. And it's generally actually slower to run the code. And then of course there's that learning curve. You have to learn the actual library or the actual framework. And so let's take a look at the speed comparison between vanilla JavaScript, which is just the JavaScript we've been learning, and some of the very, very popular libraries. And so if you run document.getElementById test table, which all it does is get that part of the DOM, you see every single second vanilla JavaScript can do it about 12 million times. Whereas jQuery, if you do the analogous grab the hash test table, it can only run 350,000 of those every second. It gets even worse when you do tag names. So document.getElementByTagNames span. In vanilla JavaScript, you can do it 8 million times, whereas in jQuery, it's only below 20,000. And so you have a big speed trade-off there. Again, a lot of times it's not noticed, but if you're doing very complex things, vanilla JavaScript might be the way to go. And so another tool that we'll talk about are called task runners. Some popular examples of those are Grunt, Gulp, Webpack, Cake, Broccoli. There are a lot of others. You can write custom ones. And what it does is it automates repetitive tasks. So just like some people might write scripts to automate boring things in their normal workflow, these are specialized ones, and other people add to them rather than you having to write everything. And so exactly, you can use plugins that other people have written. So you don't have to write your own plugin for every single thing that you want done. And so what this allows you to do is create complex tasks for building your app, or watching and live reloading pages, or really whatever you want them to do. They're very, very customizable. And so the one we're going to use is called Grunt, and I'll show you an example of a Grunt file. But before I do, what is kind of an alternative to using a task runner, something that we've already learned to automate tasks for you, or to write simple scripts for you? So if you have some simple scripts that you know you'll have to run a lot, and you don't want to remember all of the scripts, what may we do in our package.json? Anybody remember? Our scripts object in our package.json, it allows us to create basic scripts, right? And so you can actually replace task runners outright with NPM, though it gets a little convoluted if you try to have very complex tasks. But again, something you could definitely do. And so an example of a Grunt file, we notice the file type is a JavaScript, so it's a JavaScript task runner, and it's a JavaScript file for its config file. And so we have what looks like something very, very complicated. Module.exports, first line. What does that mean? What's module.exports? Shira? Yeah, so presumably this big function that we're writing is going to get exported and included into some other JavaScript file. And so it's a function that takes grunt, and first we initialize the config and read the package.json. And then we have these objects that I have written and that you will write that do some tasks for us. And so the first one, line 5, is called stylus. What is stylus again? Does anybody remember from earlier? Barty? Yes, a CSS preprocessor. It allows us to write some syntactically easier code, which then transpiles into CSS. But we first need to actually get it from that stylus to the CSS. And so we have a grunt task that'll do that for us. And so each one of these tasks is a separate module that we load from NPM. And there's documentation online, but I've written most of it for you. We give it no special options, and all we're doing is we're taking this file on the left, or the file on the right within our app/stylesheet/style.stylus, and transpiling it into a CSS file that's located in our public folder. Later we have this thing called uglify, and we're minifying our JS. Does anybody know why we might do that? Yeah. Yeah, it saves space. So if we have a JavaScript file, for readability's sake, we might have a lot of white space or very well-named variables that might be unnecessarily long. And if we're sending that file to a ton of people who are presumably visiting our website, it's a lot of wasted bandwidth. Why not just strip out all of the white space or turn every 40-character variable name into one that's 1 or 2 characters long? And so we do that through a process called uglification or minification. And this is a grunt package that'll do that for us. And so we have reserve DOM properties true, which is an option that says if you see something like document.getElementById, and we give it a string like body, don't change those properties, because you may see getElementById is a very long method name, but don't change it because it's part of the DOM and it has to be called that. And then we have another option where we're telling it what files to use. And so it's saying our current working directory is app/js, which is where all of our JavaScript files will be located. And our destination is in our public/js folder. And just sources is everything that's a JS file, minify that. And then put it in public with the extension .min.js. And so a lot of people Some very famous professors that I know, when they want to minify their JavaScript, they'll actually cut and paste it into a separate web window that does it automatically, take that output, cut and paste that into a new file, save that, put it in their public folder, and they're like, oh, okay, I just minified my JavaScript. Then they change one thing and they're like, uh-oh, now I have to cut and paste that back into that same website, cut and paste that code into the other code, overwrite the old code. Oh shoot, there's a bug, let me do that all over again. And so that gets very, very tedious, and that's how people used to have to do it. And so now with this, you just say, hey, here's where my source files are, here's where I want them to ultimately be, do your thing. And so what if you then want to have it automatically minify things, or automatically transpile the CSS every single time you make a change? There's a Grunt package for that, and it's called watch. And so what it does, it watches for any updates and reloads the page if so. And so not only does it re-transpile everything, re-minify everything, it also will automatically reload your browser window for you. That way you instantly see everything take change. And so watch will take a bunch of different objects. I created one for the CSS, which means if any of these files, the Grunt file or anything in my app/style sheets, which is where my stylus is located, if any of those change, run this task. The task is called stylus, which matches up with our object name up here, this one up here. Later we have JavaScript, which says if any of these files gets changed, the Grunt file, which is this file, or anything within my app/js directory, run this task, which is called uglify, which is which? The one we defined up here. And lastly, HTML, if any of our app/views change, we don't actually have to run any tasks, but I just want you to live reload the page for me. And so what that says is run a live reload server on port 10,000, and then within our stylus page, we'll say, hey, just listen at port 10,000. If you see me call the live reload, then refresh the page. And then we have to include the NPM tasks for us. This is all in any of the docs that you might read. And then expose a certain number of commands. So if you run grunt do this, it doesn't know exactly what combination of those commands that you defined to do. And so we have a default one, which will run stylus, which turns everything into CSS. It runs uglify, which minifies our JS, and then runs watch, which will then just start a watching server and just sit there. But if we want to build our app, we don't necessarily want it to watch because we have to actually manually stop the watching. And so I also created this thing called a publish command, which only runs stylus and uglification. Does that make sense? And so now how do we run these things? We can just run grunt, and it will run those three tasks that we defined. So first you see stylus running, then you see uglify running, and now you see the watch task. And now it's just waiting. And so if we make any changes, it will refresh. It will automatically run whatever task we define, and then just wait for you to make another change, and also live reload your page. We also have the other grunt publish, which only runs stylus and uglification. Any questions on grunt? Any questions on anything that we've run so far?
One thing,
yeah.
Did you define those command line things, or is that just like grunts, sort of?
So meaning the keyword grunt. So in order to have the keyword grunt, so if I just run grunt alone, it'll say, hey, fatal error, unable to find local grunt. If you're seeing this message, grunt has been installed locally to your project. For more information about installing and configuring, see the Getting Started guide, and it links you to their documentation. So thinking back to everything that we've learned about NPM and Node.js, are you able to understand what this is saying? I see a few nods. Allison, what were you thinking? Exactly, right? So we've talked about how modular NPM is and how everything, if you have separate folders or have separate applications, you want the local dependencies to be only installed for that project. And so it's saying, hey, unable to find a local grunt, which means I want you to install grunt as an npm module here in this current directory. And so how would we do that? We would run npm install grunt. Also, you'll probably want to do npm install grunt-cli, which gives you access to the grunt command, rather than just the grunt package. And that's all explained within the documentation if you look into that. Also, with grunt, we are loading tasks from node modules, which means we'll also have to npm install grunt-contrib-stylus. So that kind of concludes all of the, not yet, Express on the front end. So we've used Express quite a lot, right? You're all Express masters at this point. And now we get to see it used on the front end. So last week we used it a lot on the back end as an API server, which serves JSON. But it's also used to serve web views. What sort of web views? Well, it understands Pug and all of the other template engines that I mentioned just by default. And so we can say, hey, serve this Pug file as HTML. And so our stack now is we have Express as our web server. We have Pug as our view engine. We have Stylus as our CSS preprocessor. And Grunt as our task runner, which does what? It transpiles our stylus, it minifies our JavaScript, among any other tasks that we then want to add a little later. And so now we have what's getting close to a professional web stack. We are purposely choosing not to use any JavaScript libraries or frameworks. No libraries, just because we want more practice with our vanilla JavaScript. And no frameworks, just because they're so in-depth. By the time I finish teaching them, school would have started. So, does anybody have any questions on the topics that we've discussed today? Yeah?
To run Grunt, would you have to add that to your package.json object scripts?
Yep, exactly. Yeah?
So what's the difference between Express and like Angular and those things, or are they doing the same thing?
Okay, so question is, what is the difference between Express and these front-end frameworks like Angular or React? So Express is more back-end stuff. What it does is it creates a web server that serves pages when requests are made, whereas Angular and React are now front-end frameworks. And so Express will run only on your back-end, and these JavaScript frameworks like Angular and React will run in the client's browser, and so it's on the front end.
But you said Express can also do front-end stuff?
Express can serve front-end pages. And so just like we have a server that makes responses every time you make an API request, we also have a front-end server that will send responses every time you submit a request. And those responses now, rather than being JSON, are HTML, which is understood by the browser. And so, like Google, for example, has an API, and they also have a web server. And so if you visit www.google.com, which server are you pinging?
Web server?
Yeah, the web server, which will then serve you the www.google.com index HTML page. When you make a query, which one are you interfacing with? Still the front end one. You're saying, hey, give me this page, google.com, $Q equals cats, which sends a request to the front end server, the web server, the front end server may make a request to the API server for the query, but will then return stuff to you because you're only talking to the front end server. The only time you talk to the back end server is if you're using their API. And so the distinction there is what gets returned to you. Is it a full view like HTML, or is it just raw data in like JSON or XML form? And so we are choosing to use Express for both sides. So Express that sends JSON back with our API, and Express that sends HTML back on our front end. Yeah, Jason.
What was Flask?
Flask is Python's analogous software to Express. And so what it does is it allows you to create web servers using Python rather than Node.js. Any other questions at all? Anything you want cleared up? Yeah.
I'm confused by like Express and like Node.js, like the relationship.
Okay. So the question is, what's the difference between Express and Node.js? What are their distinctions? When would you use one without the other? And so Express is a framework for Node.js. So you can't use Express without using Node. Just like Flask is a framework for Python, or like Standard I/O is a library for C. You can't really use Standard I/O without using a C file. And so you're using Express as a tool in order to create a web server. And so as we talked about earlier, frameworks are pretty much a bare bones application with a defined path or flow which pulls your code. And so Express is a framework. It has kind of a determined flow with all of its middleware, and then it pulls our code. So the middleware that we define will get pulled into the application's flow. And so we use Node.js as a language to define exactly what we want Express to do. And so Node.js is the Chrome V8 engine. So as we talked about on the very, very first day, if you remember, is that each browser understands JavaScript. It's the only programming language that every single browser understands. And so each browser has its own engine or runtime, something that understands the JavaScript, and Chrome's is called V8. And so somebody back in 2009 decided to port V8 to the back end, meaning they wrote this thing called Node.js, which allows servers to understand JavaScript. Because back in the day, the only thing that servers would understand would be like PHP or Python, Ruby. There are a ton of languages, but JavaScript was not one of them. And so some guy was saying, hey, why are we all forced to write JavaScript on the front end and something else in the back end? Why can't we just write JavaScript on our back end as well? And so Node.js was this thing that somebody wrote that allows servers to understand JavaScript. And so with the ability to write JavaScript on our servers, the ability for those servers to understand JavaScript, we now want a set of tools to do these things that we'll do very often, like serving up web pages. And so rather than every time you want to write a web server, to have you say, hey, you know JavaScript, you're all JavaScript masters, write this thing from scratch. We're like, no, this is something we'll be doing a lot. Why don't we write just some template that can call whenever we want? And so that's why frameworks are made. It's something that you'll do very often, and somebody will then say, hey, rather than recreating the wheel every time, why don't we have some big group of code that's written by a lot of people, so it's presumably very good code that's been reviewed by a lot of experts. Why don't we create that into something that everybody pulls from at the beginning? And so that's where Express was born. And so this is something we'll do very often, like creating web servers. And so Express is just a collection of JavaScript code that allows us to do that, rather than having to recreate it every single time. Does that make sense? Awesome. Any other questions or distinctions that you're confused about? I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah?
Just make sure my understanding of Grunt is correct. You run Grunt every time you want to. So you have like a directory with all your JavaScript files.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to put your code live, then you can run Grunt to minify and uglify it, just so it's faster. And then you use those minified and uglified files instead.
Yeah, so question is, what exactly is Grunt? Why are we using Grunt? Like, what's the point? And so Grunt is really just a tool that can do whatever you want. It's like a multi-tool, per se. And so say we are finished coding all of our stuff, and we now want to send our website live. We have to remember to do a bunch of things, like minify our JavaScript, or change our stylus into CSS. Maybe we wanted to change our pug into HTML, rather than having Express render it every single time. And so rather than having to run all these steps ourselves, we might start to say, hey, I'm going to have it, or let me start over. When we're doing all these things, we don't want to forget a step. So we may have something like a to-do list, like to-do, I need to remember to change my JavaScript into minified JavaScript and put it in this file or folder. I need to remember to compile my CSS. Maybe there's a ton of other things that you also need to remember to do. And so you have this to-do list off to your side. And then say for everything in the to-do list, it might be a tedious process, like cutting and pasting your JavaScript into a web page, which then minifies it for you, cutting and pasting that result into a new file. And so, hey, we're computer scientists, we love automation, why don't we try to start automating these tasks? And so just like Express was born out of people's need for creating web servers all the time, these small Grunt packages were made for to address the issue that everybody has to minify their JavaScript all the time, and we may not want to do it very tediously and manually using separate web pages. So somebody wrote this package that does that automatically for us. And so why don't we use that rather than doing it manually? And then for uglifying or for transpiling our CSS, why don't we also run a script to do that? And then further abstracting, why don't we run a script to run all of our scripts? And that's exactly what Grunt does. It's a way to keep track of your to-do list programmatically and have all of those steps in your to-do list self-execute. And so maybe we want different to-do lists depending on different things that we want to do. And so that's what our Grunt tasks are. So at the bottom, we have grunt.registerTask. We have default publish. And so depending on what we're doing, we might have different things running. And so when we're developing, maybe we want to transpile our CSS and uglify our JS and have an additional tool that will watch all these files and automatically rerun the task every time one of them's changed. And so rather than having that as a separate to-do list in a separate file, we say, hey, we've already written these things. Let's just create a task out of these bullet points that we created up there. And so we don't necessarily want to watch these files for update every time we want to build our app. So let's write another separate task called publish, which only runs a subset of those tasks that we defined above. And so we can start to create more complex ones, a bunch of different ones. Maybe we want a grunt build or a grunt dev or a grunt minify this one thing so I can emote to my friend, or any single grunt thing that we want. And so if you Google around for grunt contrib stuff, those are currently modules that Grunt, the people who write Grunt, actively develop and keep track of. And so with any of these, you're guaranteed that they'll be updated fairly recently. But there are a ton of Grunt tasks that you can do. So if you just look up gruntjs.com, there are a ton. There are Grunt plugins to transpile your CoffeeScript or your Jade or Pug, handlebars, JS Hint. JS Hint being a linter, which will read through your JavaScript files to make sure they're syntactically correct and they look nice. But there are tons and tons of tasks and plugins that you can use. And so here's just an exhaustive list of all of them. Does that clear up any issues about Grunt? Does everybody understand why we would want to use something like that? For a project like this, it's not as important or crucial to use Grunt. There aren't very many things that we want to do. We can just turn them into NPM scripts instead. But for more complex things, where you want more configuration maybe for each separate task that you do, that's when you start wanting to use Grunt because it's more configurable than just an NPM script. Yeah, a couple questions over here. Yeah.
So my question is, last week we would run Mongo
Mhm.
Pretty frequently. Is that something we would ask Grunt to do, or if we made Grunt do that, would that like delete our whole database every time?
No, that's absolutely something you might want Grunt to do, is say, hey, start this Mongo script. You can even say, hey, start this Mongo server and also insert all of this test data for us. We can also use Grunt to run tests for us. It's very, very flexible and can bend to your will. Yeah. Yeah.
So, every time you described a new idea, you listed like a bunch of different technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and then you chose like Grunt and like Silas and stuff. Did you choose these ones for any reason?
Yeah, so question is, there's a lot of technology out there. How do you go about choosing your stack? So the reason I went with Express, first of all, so here's our stack. The reason I went with Express is because it's absolutely the best one. There's not that much, like everybody agrees Express is the way to go when we want to create a Node.js server. For a Vue engine, that's another tough one. The reason I like Pug or Jade. It used to be called Jade, if anybody heard that term. The reason I chose Pug is because, one, it's so similar to HTML, it's very easy to get started. Two, it looks nicer, in my opinion, than a lot of the other view engines. Some of them, you still have to have tags. Just like Jinja, you're still writing HTML tags with beginning and closing tags. Pug, you don't. It's the default in Express. So the Express people thought it was the best one, and it's just the one I was most comfortable with. Maybe something else might be better, but for me, for simple projects, Jade is the way to go because I already know the documentation. And so the startup cost is less. And I think the startup costs for you won't be that high just because it's very similar to HTML. Why did I choose Stylus? Same reason. It was just what I was comfortable with. Why did I choose it in the first place is because it's a superset of CSS. And so I was fairly comfortable with CSS, and Stylus looks exactly like CSS. And in fact, CSS is compatible syntax with Stylus. And so that's why I chose Stylus. Why did I choose Grunt over Webpack or Gulp? Grunt used to be the most popular, and it's the most configurable. So it might be a little more complicated in terms of writing the Grunt file and having those large objects, but it's the most flexible out of all of them. But when you go about choosing your own stack, it's personal preference. There's so much out there. They do pretty much the same thing in almost every single case. And so for the average use case, it doesn't matter which one you choose. And it's only if you happen to choose a specialized corner case where you might have to use Webpack rather than Grunt. Or maybe Webpack was created more specially for what you're doing, even though you could do it in Grunt. And so it's just research that you do. You'll start to develop favorites depending on what syntax makes sense to you. But for the most part, it's comfortability. Any other questions, concerns? Yeah?
Are there some framework and library that are like compatible with each other? Because I know like jQuery and Ingo don't work well together.
So the question is, do libraries and frameworks always work well together? Do some of them work better together than others? Do some of them not work together at all? It depends on your use case. So the only times you'll run into any conflicts is if they share a namespace. So say jQuery is the $sign, and say I wrote my own library that also used the $sign as its key. So that would be a little bit conflicting. But other than that, there isn't really a reason why they shouldn't work together. The more libraries that you include, the more startup cost there is for the user to open your page, just because it's a lot of code that needs to be loaded from other sources. But there's generally not a reason why they won't work together, unless they're doing the exact same thing. So like Angular 1 and Angular 2 might not work together just because they're both trying to accomplish the same task, and they'll butt heads when it comes to that. So generally don't use two of the same frameworks that do the exact same thing. But other than that, they should all work together fine. You should be able to use jQuery and underscore at the same time. Maybe also you want to use Moment, you can absolutely do that. Does that answer your question? Any other questions, concerns? All right, so today I'm giving you a little extra time for hack time just because it's a little more than we've done before. So your project for today which I just pushed, is I have now given you a completely bare bones web server. And so I've written a lot of the code for you, and you have a to-do.txt. And so let's check that out. Was everybody able to pull this code? Are you getting merge conflicts galore? We're all masters at Git now, right? So I just pushed this code. It's in day 4, morning/exercises. I'll give you a few seconds to get it pulled. Was everybody able to get it pulled? Are people having merge conflicts? Lots. Well, I'll let you take care of your merge conflicts as soon as hack time starts, but I'm going to go ahead and go through what we're going to do today. And so if we look into todo.txt, we see, first I want you to read and understand the stylus and pug code, which is stored in app. And so the way I organize this is we have in our root directory anything that gets called directly, which is our app.js, which is our express file, our grunt file, and our package.json. Everything else gets called from another file. And so that I put in our app file or folder. Sorry that I called them both app. And then public is what gets exposed to the public. And so within app, we have some models. Who remembers what models are? MVC? Everyone? Tiff, you want to explain what are models? Yeah, so it's all of our data. And so our config file, which is like hard-coded information, and students.js, which remember is a list of some people here, maybe not all the people. Style sheets, part of our views, are stored in a separate file. And so that's all of our stylus files. Maybe we want multiple stylus files that can import each other. And then in views, we have all of our pug files. And so pug files, they can extend templates. I'll let you explore that in a little bit. And so that makes up our app file. And so when we start writing JavaScript, where do we think that should go? If we have a scripts.js. So does that get called directly, or does that get included into another page or another file? Anyone have any idea? Galen, what do you think? So if we are going to start writing a JavaScript file, where in our app or where in our directory structure do you think we're going to put it? Good idea. So they're not actually models, they're more controllers because they take user input and then translate them into logic for us. So they actually are going to get their own folder within our app folder. And so you can call it controllers. I generally call it just JS. So that will go in there. And then after everything's minified and exposed to the public, we'll put it in our public folder. So within public, we have style sheets, which is where our compiled CSS will go. We'll have a JavaScript folder, which is where our minified JavaScript will go. If we have any images that we want to show to the public, so anything that's accessible by the public will go in its own folder in public. And so that's the general directory structure for our app. And so let's, again, check out the to-do. So first, read and understand the stylus and pug code. It's in app/stylesheets and app.views, respectively. Then read and understand all the express code in app.js, but don't yet start the to-dos. Just make sure you understand what's going on. There's some new things in there. Read and understand the grunt file. Complete any to-dos in that file. And then once you're done with that, start tackling the to-dos in app.js. So since we're not adding to what we've been working on so far, we can go ahead and re-roll for partners. When do we do that? Day 1? All right, so your partners for today are as follows. And let me know if your partner is not here. I think Haley's not here today. Will's not here. So Dong and Daniel, you are now partners. But go ahead and find your partners and start working through the exercises. Yeah. Oh, I thought I put you on. Oh, I reset.
Oh, sorry.
You can partner with Gerardo, and then they're no longer a group of 3. So you 2 are together. So feel free to either work in here, or you can start to explode out into the.
Sure.
out there so it's not as crowded in here.
Thank you. Yeah, me too.
So,
So if you have any questions, Kevin is here as well. He can answer.